Really, no, really, and all of them have been really great. But the diversity of the talks here, it's just been fantastic. And so on the home straight, the question is now, where do we go next? Do we want to do something? What would we like to do? And so I'm just going to sort of really open the floor to discussion. I'll just say a few things first, and then see where you all take it, and we'll try and bring it together in some notes later on. So just to sort of summarize a little bit about the kinds of things that have been happening or going on at different levels, and see how we could try and connect the dots. And what we don't have in here is a lot of stuff that David mentioned about all the White House activities. We should include that, I think, moving forward. So, there have been a lot of, there's a growing number of sort of regional case studies trying to synthesize blue carbon around the country. We talked about the Snohomish Estuary, which is an example in the Pacific Northwest, McCoy Bay in New England. We've got the Tampa Bay assessment going on in Florida. There's been an assessment in San Francisco Bay. And there's a number of federal initiatives that are starting to develop. The federal agencies have a blue carbon group. So within each federal agency is represented within this blue carbon group. And if you have an interest in blue carbon, there's somebody in each of those federal agencies that you can talk to about partnering with. So they're very interested in hearing. They're particularly interested in hearing at the state and local level about how they can be helpful and try to help move things forward. And then there's some funding coming through. National Estuaries Program have a small pot of money for blue carbon. It's coming out last year and again this year. So there'll be more opportunities from the federal level. I mentioned the NASA Blue Carbon Monitoring System, an example of a national project. There's the National Greenhouse Gas Assessment work, and more science can help there. That's the database that feeds into this. And also, one of the things that has been going on is as we've been moving around, gradually people are starting to coalesce into these kind of blue carbon working groups at the regional scale or the local scale. Oregon is actually now expanded to become a Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Puget Sound area, has a pretty coherent blue carbon working group right now, which are going after research proposals to fund work. Maine and New England also have got a blue carbon working group, and that we're hoping to see more activity, particularly around the Gulf Coast, so that's part of the reason why we've been moving around here. And what we also have, just to feed into it all, is Ray has established a national blue carbon working group. So there's kind of tiers of working groups here. There's the international, national, and local. And in this working group, actually, there's a picture of them all. We have representations from the federal agencies, a number of the funding agencies at the state level, like the California Fish and Wildlife Service, the folks in Washington, the folks in New England, and then we have some of the science community as well. So what we try to do here is bring together the developing regional working groups together with the feds and the science network, so we're all talking together and sharing information and coordinating. So if there's a regional working group develops here, we can connect you all in, so you're not reinventing wheels. Everybody's learning from each other about what's been going on. And the NERs are a very important part of that. And so I'm going to be quiet in a moment. So of what I've been listening to today, these are the kind of things. I'm actually going to add education, not necessarily at the bottom, but education to the list, which I missed when we were drafting this list. So what are the opportunities here within this particular group of people? It'll be, by forming a group in some sort of way, it's a lot easier to go after financing because you become an entity. When we set up the first International Blue Carbon Working Group with Conservation International IUCN, we had no money, but we put out a flag and everything came towards it, and it was very successful. So I encourage you to put out a flag and say, we have a blue carbon group here of interest. You have great experience, a lot of great science going on here, but you have a lot of really great policy work as well. How often do you have a chair of a White House committee, within your community? So that is a really good opportunity there. One of the things we're doing internationally is trying to take the science and communicate it with the policy, because the two have to be tied together. So there's an opportunity to think through some of those things here. I really like the opportunity to link with green infrastructure. There's a lot of developing blue carbon science going. The new front is green infrastructure. How can we connect the two together? Also, is ocean acidification is an additional one. How can we connect it with ocean acidification mitigation? Again, on the technical side, the stacking with ecosystem services and how those finances work that's a really important information gap that we need to fill. How do we do this technically? And so I'd love to hear thoughts on that develop. You have large landowners here. We don't have any of the ranchers in the room. Maybe they'd be an interesting group to reach out to. Fish and Wildlife Service being present. As Scott mentioned, they were instrumental in a lot of the developing forestry and peatlands work that's been going on. And if you have an agency like that or a landowner like that, that's a very good step. You have the capacity here to develop.
Yeah, I was just going to mention too that we have homeowners association here for the first time. So they're interested in the wetlands that they manage as well.
Okay, very, very good. Developing feasibility assessments at different scales. Just at the landscape scale, what's the potential scale of the opportunities? We've been doing the national stuff. We've been working out, there's 10 million tons sequestered CO2 from natural wetlands. 10 million's lost from the Mississippi Delta. And we've heard a bit about the seagrasses here. Trying to get a sense of what the scale of the opportunity is, how you might fit it together with conservation needs. So I think developing demonstration activities or feasibility assessments would actually feed up the chain very effectively. And one of the other things that you've got here is access to funding streams. Some of the other areas we went to, they didn't have so much access. You have the NERS system, the NERS Science Collaborative, which has been, for the blue carbon, has been a mainstream of funding, and that's been very helpful. You have Sentinels. You have a Sentinel site here. I'm not exactly sure what the funding is for Sentinel sites, whether that's NOAA or where that comes from. It's NERS as well. Thank you. And then you have the National Estuary Program as well, EPA. So you actually have a number of federally funded funding streams right here, and that's a nice luxury to have as well. So I just wanted to point out some of these opportunities that you have, and I'm just now going to open it to the floor as a discussion. What have you heard today? Do you think there's something useful here? Is this the kind of thing that you would like to see moving forward? And then let's just see where the conversation goes. How does that sound? I'm going to be quiet.
Look back at maybe some of you have been taking notes on that purple sheet. We have those four or five questions, like 4 questions highlighted there, and what you've been thinking about. What are the opportunities? Also, what are the barriers? I think it's always important to identify what the barriers are going forward too. Who's not in this room? Who should be part of that conversation? That's always really important to remember who's not here and who to invite for future discussions.
Okay, so I just want to highlight another opportunity, and it's called Deepwater Horizon. The consent decree was made public, about a month ago now, maybe less time than that, which basically says, okay, we have a little over $20 billion. This is how it's going to be broken up. Now, $8.8 billion is essentially locked up in NERDA, but there is another $4.4 billion that goes through the Restore Council that is available, and all that is for restoration. There's all the different buckets, but there's a significant amount of money that would be available. They've already done some early projects. Part of that actually has been, kind of hydrologic reconnection within, I think that might even be a Texas project that NOAA had proposed, but I could be wrong on that. In the next draft of the Restore Science Plan, ecosystem services are going to figure prominently in that. They already figure prominently in the first version. So I think blue carbon can, where you can prove up blue carbon as part of a package of benefits coming from a restoration project would make that project even more attractive potentially to the council itself. So I think there's a real opportunity there to move out on.
Wonderful. Thanks, David.
Yeah. Can I just ask what the timeline would be to try and formulate something so you could apply for the money? Is this like a rush, or is this something that's going to phase over a number of years?
Well, 10, 15, up to 20 years. So it's been going on for quite a while. The problem is the process has to run through the state agencies, the
terms of who on the council is saying if there's state projects or federal projects, and nobody has to
I work for the Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries Program, which is a national estuary program. And this year we had, so when we decide on what projects we're going to fund for the year, all the stakeholders get together and people kind of discuss what they think the needs are or projects that they'd like to see done and things like that. So this year someone brought up a blue carbon project to try and quantify what the carbon is in our marshes and seagrass and stuff. And everyone was really confused, I think, and it was a new concept to a lot of people in the room. And I think also people were kind of like, okay, so if we get this information, then what do we do locally? Like, we're not going to change regulations or start making industry mitigate for carbon. So I think that was kind of where we came to a stopping point. People were like, okay, if we find this information, what are we going to do? Because our program, we have a lot of restoration projects, land acquisition to conserve the land and stuff, but that concept, I think, locally, people were having a hard time with what do we do with that information. So I don't know if you have any pointers or just for discussion, because I'm sure, you know, it'll come up again this year for another project, or, I mean, I don't know.
Was that the EPA's National Estuary Program funding for blue carbon? That was the opportunity that came up, or was it something else?
No, it was a professor here, actually. She just was saying maybe we should quantify what we have here in our habitats and stuff. And so, but the group was kind of like, okay. Yeah, or some of it could have been EPA or local funds. It wasn't for a specific type of funding that time, but I don't know. I was just kind of at this, having a hard time trying to figure out also what locally, you know. I mean, I guess it would add to a bank of information for people to use, but I think people like to see more action locally that can happen with the data or the information.
I think one way is that the Pacific Northwest group and the McCoy Bay, New England group have moved forward pretty effectively on is what they want to try and achieve is they're setting out what they think is the priorities of information needs that they have, and then trying to connect that into a management framework. So should they focus their science in a particular estuary and then try and broaden out, say from the NERS, so that they can get a landscape assessment of how development, how climate change is likely to affect, in this case, blue carbon. They also think about other ecosystem services, but they think about blue carbon in this case. And I think by having gone through that thought process of prioritizing their information needs and how they're going to use it, and it's allowing them to get proposals together to try and get the funding to try and tie all of this together. So here is an example maybe where somebody's come up with an idea we should do something here. And the challenge is, well, we don't all know how it all connects together and the value of it. And so maybe if there was a group here who were starting to think about how all of this connects together, and maybe it built around the NERS or around the Estuaries program, how they would link it into a coordinated activity of other things that they want to know about, and then you can assess, you know, where you want to take it. And I think because blue carbon is so new, people are like, well, you know, what is this? What is this? How does it relate to green, red, and all that stuff? So, so hopefully after this meeting, you all can start getting a sense of how it ties together. And then people like me and others in the room, Scott and Ray, are very happy to try. And if you have ideas and you want to sort of test them against an ear, then we're happy to bounce ideas with you too. Yeah.
So maybe the answer is if it opens the door, right, to funding streams that maybe wouldn't have been there if we didn't have the information to help further, you know, conservation work, then that's the avenue we need to go down. You know, if there's these funding streams that are tied to blue carbon, apparently not right now, right? Because it's a voluntary.
Well, you know, it's developing, I think. You know, when we were in DC having discussions with various folks a couple of weeks ago, One thing that's moving from CEQ through to the agencies is the importance of thinking about ecosystem services. What's also moving through that they're trying to coordinate in is how do you think about landscape carbon sequestration or greenhouse gas reduction, emissions reductions. So I think through the agencies and their funding streams, they're all going to be looking at both of these things together.
Right.
And so there will be, I think, funding tied to understanding the carbon sequestration aspect of it.
So maybe that's the point we need to make then is, on that kind of proposal, is that it'll open the doors to funding streams, having that data.
I think that's a very, very strong point to make because, like Steve was saying, there are agencies, and I specifically know I've seen grant opportunities, grant proposals come through, where they're looking for projects that not only increase understanding of ecosystem services, but also have a climate mitigation or increase in coastal resiliency aspect of that project. And blue carbon fits most of those avenues. So in that way, you're right. I mean, it opens up the doors if you already have your baseline quantification for your local area. It can really strengthen this type of proposal. But it can also strengthen discussions that you have within your own community here with policymakers, with other state and state agencies and reserve folks. If you can tell them, you can give specific value to what their carbon potential is in this area, then that's a great strength in that discussion as well. And get more people interested in developing those partnerships that lead to projects.
And also linking it to that feasibility, like if you have a whole framework for where you're going with this as far as a project, so you link it to that feasibility first step in that project timeline, and then maybe even like the Lone Star Coastal Exchange. I don't know if anyone in here is familiar with that, but they're all about these voluntary markets and trying to get things going on a large scale. So it's not exactly in our area, but they're doing something like that, and our habitats aren't that different from the habitats in the northern part of Texas, so that could be an option, Lone Star Coastal Exchange.
Yeah, I imagine in the not too distant future, questions will be asked about if you're developing a plan in a coastal area, how does it relate to climate change adaptation? How does it relate to how you're managing greenhouse gases? In California, there's some funding, I wouldn't say it's a lot, for cities to work on their climate change mitigation plan. What are they doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And adaptation is becoming part of that, and they're starting to link these things together. One of the things that we've identified as part of the national assessment is we need regional emissions factors. If there's an activity, what does it mean in terms of greenhouse gas fluxes? And we've identified that as a real data need. And the EPA, in fact, many of the agencies are really getting behind trying to help us improve the greenhouse gas accounting for the national accounts so that we can improve management. So even basic science on greenhouse gas fluxes, I think, will probably get more support in terms of science. And then I think any plan that sort of helps understand management activities will start to get more interest if you can illustrate the greenhouse gas part of it as well as the other parts as well. So the more you cover all the bases, I think the more, you tick more of the boxes in terms of potential funding streams and the like.
This is great. So what else?
Over here.
So in your presentation, a couple of the presentations I saw, McCoy Bay had a project funded through Neuroscience Collaborative. Do you know, and I've only seen the title, so I don't know, do you know any more information about what project they're doing?
There's been two, so they've been quite lucky. The first one was looking at, it was actually started off as a link between nitrogen and carbon cycling within the coastal wetlands, because there they have a lot of nitrogen loading. And but it migrated more to just a general understanding of whole marsh organic and inorganic carbon flux assessment. As part of that, because we'd been, what was also attached to the project, we were looking for funding of the methodology. And so the two projects came together. And actually, one of the real benefits, I didn't mention the education, I forgot to mention the education. One of the real benefits of that McCoy project is, yes, we really improved the quantification of the carbon budgets for those wetlands, and we developed the methodology. But really, the education component was really important too. And the NERS went out to the local agencies, the local state agencies, and held a lot of briefings, or a number of briefings, which led to Massachusetts wanting to include coastal wetlands within the state greenhouse gas accounting. And so they're the first state to do this, to look at this. And the Department of Environmental Restoration working on including greenhouse gases within their restoration assessments. So I think the education component, at least at that stage, the state agencies was really important, which came out of the McCoy project, which could be replicated in other NERs. The new project, which is ongoing right now, is to look at a particular restoration opportunity, which is a big project. It's a $40 million project with a big, infrastructure that's blocking. It's blocking off the tide, and the restoration plan that already exists is to remove the infrastructure and restore wetlands. And so that's being used to understand the greenhouse gas implications of restoring those wetlands as it goes from being scrub, shrub, wet, freshwater, to being more of a saline system. And again, what was really important that got the funding from the NERS Science Collaborative was the technical strength of it, but the communication and the education outreach part of it was very strong to that funder.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering, since all these reserves have now had a blue carbon workshop, maybe we all be motivated to work together and have a goal proposal for NERS Science Collaborative for blue carbon in some way.
Yeah, and here's the website. I just pulled it up. It's also on your list of resources in your folder, and I will email that to you afterwards so you have all these links. But one thing, because education did come up, and it came up in some of the pre-workshop surveys, they did these great, they have fact sheets, which some of those are in your binders, but also this resources for teachers. They have some videos on here, a ton of resources. You could I've been on this website and spent hours on it, just looking at everything they have. Information for partners and funders, so take a look at it and check it out.
I would mention that one of the challenges a little bit with the NERS program right now, with the NERS Science Collaborative, I think we had the largest grant ever through the collaborative on the last series of funding, and we got 1.3 million. This year, I think it's this now period of funding, whatever, 5-year, whatever it is, each year they bring out funding. I think the largest project is 750. So that really, we originally wanted to do 2 NERs together, and then the amount of science, it sort of squeezed us down to 1. So that's, one of the challenges is that as more NERs become knowledgeable about it, you're more competing against yourselves for that little pot. But, yeah.
Right. Well, so one group that's not represented here is who actually owns the wetlands, and that's the General Land Office. So maybe add them for the list in the future, right?
They couldn't come because
Oh, yeah. Okay, no free food next time.
Ray, really, they can't come? They can't come? That's, okay. We'll figure that out. Yeah, they can, I can just charge them, it's a, GLO $5, everybody else free.
So I'm going to open a question up and see what kind of interest there is, but, do you think there's something enough here to maybe start building a sort of regional blue carbon activity? Would you like to try and bring that kind of focus together? Do you think there's a level of interest in the room? Let's just sort of maybe raise hands or something like that to say, yeah, that's great. Yep. Yeah. Good stuff.
And also, what training needs are out there too. I know, Ray, you mentioned a couple of things, but, that's something that's really useful for us. What can our program bring for us to make sure that this happens, to make sure that you have the resources that you need to keep moving forward?
Or the estuary program could lead the charge.
Mm-hmm.
I missed that question completely.
You've just been volunteered.
I was talking, but okay. Sounds good.
I have a question about,
What do we mean by a region? So, we're mainly coastal bend here. Some from Dallas, Columbia. What about, should we think about statewide? Do we need to talk with our colleagues upstate, up the coast? What works well?
That's a good question. You know, I guess I would say it's the scale that you think you can be effective at, is the question. Ideally, you want to at least cover some sort of landscape regional aspect. So at least to the estuary scale. And so when we started in the Pacific Northwest, we started with South Slough. And then the group said, really well, you know, we can base the science around there, but we want to do all of the Oregon coastline. And then another group started up in Puget Sound. And then they said, well, why do we have two groups? We're all talking together. And now it's a Pacific Northwest group. And that's because they had enough coverage across the entire area where they could bring capacity. Because some of it's important that, you know, if you're the guy in Oregon, it's not so easy to be talking to the policy people in Washington State. But they had all the bases covered there. So I would we're also going through this discussion a little bit in Florida. We had two workshops, one in northern Florida, one in southern Florida. And they're both trying to work out as well whether they're distinct or whether they want to try and, you know, work as a common group. And so I guess it really comes down to you all, whether you feel that, you know, you can bring together a community that can cover the range. I think there's a lot of value if you can cover the range of an entire state or even wider. You know, maybe you'll even get to the scale of having a whole Gulf Coast, you know, group that has all these things coalesced together. But at the same time, it's a lot easier maybe to start at some scale you can all manage because everybody can get together in a room and talk about stuff. So I'm going to say, well, what do you think? What do you think is a manageable scale to work with here?
What were some of the other ideas that came out of some of the other workshops? So at the reserves, especially Grand Bay, Weeks Bay, Apalachicola, where they're pretty close, did they have the idea of at least them three getting together? I mean, what was it? Okay. Or did they try to include us too? So did they say, oh, we ought to get Texas involved?
When we were first initiating this kind of goal network of workshops, which I know Jacqueline had mentioned before about, we got a lot of funding from Fish and Wildlife Coastal Program and also the NARE Science Collaborative to do this Gulf network. So our original thought was, oh, we'll have this great big Gulf network of folks. And then when we started doing the workshops, we decided it's probably better to start off small and see what grows from there. But again, it's what makes sense. So for like, right now we have an Apalachicola kind of starting off of a working group. For Weeks Bay and Grand Bay, they talked about kind of being together, Mississippi, Alabama. We actually have our first conference call in a couple weeks with the folks that are forming up that working group. We'll follow up Naples as well and this as well. So part of that funding that supports this network is that, you know, we are able to support the creation of these regional workshops. We will be sending you invitations, all of you, to join the regional working group. We'll schedule a call, and we'll also ask you guys to say again, like, who was missing from this conversation. You know, share it with your colleagues or others that you know that should be part of this discussion, who would be interested in being part of this regional working group. And we do have some funding to technically support a project to start up. That is limited, so it's kind of like first one to get going. We do have that support as well. So, you know, hopefully, maybe it'll be here that a project starts getting really initiated and we can help, you know, really support that getting going. But yeah, we're really just taking the feedback from you guys from these workshops, to go back to the original question, I guess, and that, you know, we can start off small, but if it makes sense to expand, you know, greater than Texas or just Port Aransas, or, you know, what makes sense to this group and to the people in the room and to the projects that we're looking to develop.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think it's dead right. And, you know, by starting small, it's easier to coalesce and come together. I think it's really going to depend upon energy. You know, as we've seen a lot of these activities, it requires either an individual or a group to lead the charge. And it depends what level that group is effective at. You know, if they're a local group and they're effective at that level, then it's, you know, I wouldn't want to push them to work at the state or multi-state level because, you know, they may flounder at that level. But if they work at that level, we can pull them in some way. There's no need to that everybody's at one level. There could be different geographical scales. But if you have somebody that, you know, happens to lead a lot at sort of bringing people together across states or within a state, and that's the geography that you're most effective at, work with that. So wherever you feel you could be have the most impact, I would say just go with that scale. And then, if you're local, maybe the next estuary along will form their own group, and they'll start to coalesce. What we saw in Kenya is there was one small carbon project at the community level, and it's gone through, it's been financed, it's been effective, and now all the villages south of Mombasa, they all want one, and into Tanzania, they're all really excited about it. But it took one area to sort of lead the charge, and so maybe that's a good scale to start at.
We could hijack the New York Science Collaborative grant next year and just do I don't know how many they give out, but 7 or
Something like that.
something like that.
Yeah, I really like the idea of kind of pulling together the Gulf reserves and getting a really strong proposal to use some carbon work in the Gulf area and really grow the network.
And I might just throw out that I'm guessing that at the global level, we've probably brought together maybe about $50 million worth of blue carbon projects in the last 5 years. And I think that level of interest is growing. And so while the pots are smallish right now, the NASA project, the 2 NASA projects, so that's $3 million worth of projects right there. The NERS ones, there's a 750 that a group have got. EPA is starting to fund projects. And I think as the level of interest builds, then the level of funding will build as well, I think. And so I say bring a group together, express an interest, and and then people like Ray can go talk to the folks in DC and say, oh, this great group down in Texas, maybe somebody should be funding more activities down there, and we'll see what kind of money might flow. So don't be limited by the existing funding, and we'll think about what funding should be, and we'll work that way. Scott.
Thanks. Just a couple quick ideas in response to the discussion here. It strikes me, as who else could be at the table, and maybe not initially, but private sector carbon buyer. This would be a great sort of person to be at the table pretty early in the process. And then, those questions about, well, what do we do with all this information with carbon or with these offsets? The answer is going to be, well, we have, I didn't mention that one of the larger, that bottomland hardwood restoration project, 35,000 acres was financed by Dynegy up in Houston. You've got this huge oil and gas industry right here. It's a little bit of a dicey sort of conversation for them, but I think they're all about coastal protection. That's in their sort of business interest as well. So if you could get some of those sort of people involved early on, it would really strengthen, I think, the group a lot and make these sort of pilot projects really just more tangible or maybe more possible. And just the other thought, you mentioned, do you work with the other NERS? Could you do something together? Maybe it'd be really cool to have, 2 or 3 different pilot projects going on that the NERS could work on, but be able to bring it, all those lessons learned back together to that whole group. So I don't know what that, how that looks like, but an opportunity for people in Florida, people in Mississippi and Texas to learn from what's going on in those other areas. So they might not be able to sort of work together, but certainly there could be a lot of learning, and that could be a strong sort of, as you said, sort of a strong grant proposal to act locally, but still sort of bring it back together at the regional level.
Yeah, the workshop that we had in Mississippi, we had a speaker there. It was
the research coordinator at Grand Bay, and they did a project across 9 years, and they are all looking at different carbon storage and variation within the wetlands, and so their data is about to be published. Actually, we couldn't put their PDF on our website after that workshop because they're waiting for that to be published, but once they have that data published, I think that sets a model for those NERs to work together. One was in Florida, one in Mississippi, McCoy Bay was one, and I think there were 9 altogether, so.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife seem to be a big player in some other areas. Is that a possibility here?
No. Well, I would hope that we can be, so we'll see how things come around. But certainly there were opportunities in the southeast, and maybe we can find those same kind of opportunities in refuges here.
Yeah, I think that'd be interesting. The folks at the Fish and Wildlife Service, interested in climate change, are interested in, I think, exploring some of these opportunities. And what is it, John? What's John's surname? Schmerfeld. So it might be worth maybe just having a conversation with him and see, because I think Fish and Wildlife Service nationally owns a lot of land. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity within there to look at what the opportunities are, and that's really yet to gel. There's been bits and pieces, and I didn't realize, it was great to hear Scott's presentation. It goes all the way back to the first forestry projects was Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's a very important agency. And the GS, is nobody here from the USGS, but they're really funding bringing a lot of science together. We had a meeting last week, I'm losing my weeks. There was a meeting in North Carolina, and they're establishing a USGS coastal wetlands carbon program. And so that'll be overlapping with, additional science capacity being brought in there. So, David, how do you think this sort of connects with state policy? Is it all through the Restore Act? Is there other opportunities?
State policy.
Yeah.
Geez, I don't really deal with state policy much.
Well, I think the so the opportunities, as I mentioned before, through the state are to nominate projects for Restore funding. I mean, as I said, there's 2 processes. There's the process through the federal agencies that are part of the Restore Council trustees, and then there's the state agencies. In our state, TCQ is really handling that process. Everybody in here is very familiar with that. So I think, as I said, as we move a few years down the road, where we can prove up the multiple benefits of restoration projects, blue carbon, as well as recreational fishing, as well as shoreline protection, etc. I think that's all to the benefit of that project. Everything else held equal, choosing project A over project B, the one that proves itself up in terms of being able to provide all those additional ecosystem services, I would hope in the revision or the new version of the plan would be looked upon more favorably.
Any other thoughts, or are we naturally drawing to a close? I'm going to maybe ask, just to clarify, if a group was to form, who would like to be involved in the discussions of how the group develops and moves forward? Is there a particular cohort here that would be interested in sort of providing that early leadership? A hands up? Yeah. Good.
Yeah, I would think that the estuary program and the reserve could work together on that.
Okay, let's see the hands as well, because we don't want to miss anybody. Yeah, there we go. Got the university. Very good. Yeah, great. Okay, so we've got a cohort of 5 or 6 there. Nice. So I think we'll be following up in the next little while with, I guess, through Jace. Is that the strategy? So, Jacqueline, what's the strategy for following up after this meeting?
After this meeting, you'll hear from Stefanie about the network. She'll be scheduling a call.
Within next week, you'll get all of the slides from all the presenters. We'll post those online. We'll send you the links. You'll get links to the information that's in your packet, the resources there, and yep. And then Stefanie will be organizing a conference call. So we hope you'll all participate. If you cannot make that call, and you still want to participate, just let Stefanie or I know, and I'm happy to talk to people individually too. If you're not able to make the call that we schedule. Anything else, Stefanie? Do you have anything to add?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for attending, for participating, thanks for your interest, and we look forward to working with hopefully many of you moving forward.
Yeah. But before we completely wrap up, I just want to emphasize that, if a group does build, it's not you're either in or you're either out. It's great if we've got some motivated people in the center that can help coordinate and move things forward. But they can all network through all of you, and so depending on your level of interest, you can always be tracking it, keeping an eye on it. So it's not an in or out kind of thing, but it's definitely to be in.